另外一门外语，那么主要是德语、法语、俄语、西班牙语、日语。英语课呢逐渐减少，因为这些同学进来以后啊，就他能够考进上外附中，英语已经很好了。那么英语呢仍然是重要的一门课程，所以它5节课。第二外语它是8节课的，所以它第二外语它这个花的时间呢，实际上是更多的。那么情况怎么样呢？他们是从零九年开始啊实验的。我去的时候呢，学生已经毕业了几届，这个总体来讲是非常成功的。他一个班的学生，他到高中的时候呢，绝大部分学生呢2门外语都达到了这个非常高的水平。如果是德语、法语、俄语，俄语不包括在里面，西班牙语，那么他们都能达到欧框的 B2 甚至 C1 的这个水平。那么英语这个他去考托福跟雅思的话，都接近于满分啊。这个是上外附中模式。那么还有朝阳二中模式，它是从高中开始，就是因为它是一个高中，它没有初中部。呃，学生进高中的时候呢，他有一个班，现在是两个班了啊，是这个有100人左右，每年招100人左右。就是呢，明确就是你在英语所有课程不变的基础上，是另外学一门外语的。那么主要是德语，原来是德语，因为跟德国合作的。那么实际上呢是只学2年半左右，因为他们到第3年的12月份呢就要参加这个 DSD 的这个考试了。英语每周还是保持5节课，第二外语的话呢是10节课，我这里写错了啊，应该是10节课。他们是每天下午其他同学放学以后，那么他们要上2节课的德语课才能回家，每周10节课。那么这样2年半左右呢，他们的德语也达到了，也能够考 DSD 的，就是专门就德语的一种这个证书考试，能够达到 B1 的水平，也就达到了德国高校这个录取的这个一个要求。那么德国高校他录取中国学生呢，他也看我们的高考成绩的，所以这些学生也要参加高考。那么他们的英语呢也能达到这个120分左右平均分数啊，也就是说英语和德语都学得非常好，基本掌握啊。这个是从高中开始学2门外语的。那么上外模式呢是本科生，是大学生了。就是我们学校大部分的非通用语专业，比如说俄语、德语、法语、西班牙语这个阿拉伯语等等这些专业的学生，除了学他们的专业语言以外，那么英语他也要求能够达到8级证书，他要拿到8级证书才能够拿到这个学位。因此呢，他们实际上是2门外语同时在学的。那么而且呢，这个很多学生毕业以后他很多人可能主要的工作语言还是英语，而不是他原来的那个专业语种。也就是说，这些学生同样也是掌握了2门外语。那么复旦大学这个模式呢，是这个2018年开始，教育部在全国21所，现在22所加了一所22所高校呢展开的试点，包括上外在里面上外的情况跟复旦大学不一样，上外呢因为它是语言专业的学生，复旦大学呢它是其他专业。他们试点的一个是国际国际事务，就是国际关系和这个事务这个专业，就他们是要研究国际关系国别研究的。那么还有一个是公共卫生正好这个就是公共卫生，实际上就是这种疫情什么就他们学的这个专业了，也是这个面对国际，就他们的外语要求是比较高的。所以这2个专业呢，这个试点 在大学英语的基础上再学一门外语。那么实际上也是双外语学习，但是呢，他们呢，可能这个跟前面的这个情况呢有点不一样，因为呢，大家知道啊，在大学里面，专业课程实际上已经这个任务很重了。那么大学英语呢，它每周也有这个4节课，那么复旦可能少一些，那么再加非通用语种，它每周有4节课。到了第2学期的话呢，是2节课。那么一开始啊，第一次报名的话，第1学期报名的话，我后来做了一些了解，有1000多人报名了。那么到了第2学期呢，就有几百人，400多人吧。到第3学期的话，就更少了，就几十人。那么就说明什么呢？这个第2外语对这个非语言专业的学生来讲，在其他课业都比较重的情况下，再学一门外语，实际上对他们来讲，这个非常这个任务非常艰巨，所以呢，真正坚持到后面能够学到掌握的地步的，可能不多。那么不管怎么说，我在这里介绍啊，这个4种模式，就在我们这个国家呢，那其他地方，据我所知，就说也有就比如说南京外国语学校啊，还有这个可能郑州外国语学校啊、武汉外国语，很多国内的外国语设计的外国语学校，他们一直呢都有多语种的教学，但是呢，就是它侧重于某一语种，就是2门外语并重的情况呢，这个不是很多。当然它有选修课，但是就是不是像我前面讲的，它这个课时啊达到一定程度，而且呢这个 duration 就学的时间也达到一定的这个一个时长啊。那么已经有这样的这个教学模式，有掌握2门外语的这些学生，所以呢，而且我这个为什么对这个话题特别有兴趣呢？因为我发现啊，就是我在上外附中的几年，我的这个观察发现，就是我们双语班的这个同学啊，就特别的优秀，他是全方位的优秀，综合素养非常高。他这个英语，虽然啊英语他们5节课，其他就是不学。就非双外语班的学生啊，他们的英语课是达到7节，他们英语课的课时比其他班的学生少。第2外语又花这么多时间去学，他们的英语不但不比其他同学差，实际上他们的英语能力比其他班的同学还要高。也就是说，他学第2门外语，他提高了英语的成绩，反哺了英语。而且这些学生就他的自信心特别强，他学了2门外语，他特别会安排自己的学习，因为实际上他的第2外语的课时啊是多出来的。朝阳2中的学生的情况也一样，就他这个10节课啊多出来的，他比其他同学多了10节课。这个10节课不但没有影响其他学业的这个学习，反而呢促进了其他学科成绩的学习。也就是说，他们的学习能力、认知能力、原语言意识等等都得到了这个提高，这个是值得我们去研究的。就很多人一般的人啊，认为就是说多学一门外语，那肯定很辛苦啊，这个可能弄得不好，就2门外语都学不好的啊，也影响了其他的课程的学习啊。那我们的我们的观察发现呢，恰恰相反。那么当然有人会说，那这些学生原来就很聪明啊，对吧？这个呢，我们也不否认，能够同时学2门外语的同学啊，这个肯定一般的这个基础都是比较好的。但是呢，这个不可否认的是，他们是越学越聪明，就是说更聪明，它是一个果，它不是因，因为也有很多其他优秀的同学、聪明的同学，他没有变得更优秀。 啊，他也没有去学这个第二外语啊。呃，这个是就是我们一些初步的这个观察发现。那么多语中教学成功的要素是什么呢？这个里面毫无疑问是知识发生了迁移，我们的这个能力和知识得到了拓展。我这里呢有两个这个公式，这个是我几年前在就是对我们这个上外附中的学生双外语学习者这个情况进行观察的时候，就是一个明显的感受：1+1小于2，就是学第一门外语再加第二门外语，他花的时间他一定是小于2的，就是学第二门外语的时间，它是远远低于第一门外语的。他学第一门外语的这个经验，那如果这两门外语很近的话他的知识和技能它是可以用于第二外语，它是发生很大的迁移的。那么如果是再加一门再学第三门的话，他花的时间比第二门外语还要少。他越学越会学，越学就是语种学的越多，他实际上花的时间是越小的这是一个定律，这个大家可以去做这样的一个验证这个至少我们到目前的观察发现，还有国外相关学者的这个研究发现是这样的一个情况掌握最多的语言的人达到50多种，他是越学越容易的越学越会学。那么第二个公式呢是1+1+1大于3，一是你的母语，再加一第一外语，再加一第二外语，那么它的收益要大于3。原来大家就是我们在座的有些老师同学可能知道，北京大学高一红老师他的博士学位论文，他是当时证明1+1大于2，就是你在母语的基础上再学一门语言，再学一门外语的话，你的收益要大于两者相加的总和。那么现在呢，我要这个说的呢，你再加一门外语的话呢，就相当于发生了化学反应，它跟学一门外语的同学大不一样。刚才我已经说过了，他们的综合素养这个普遍高于只学一门外语的，普遍高于我不是说人人都高于，这个是一个总的趋势而且呢，这些同学在这个性格上面，在这个就我刚才讲到的自信，还有这个 outgoing， 就是他跟人交往的这个能力上面，他这个明显的要胜过其他同学，所以掌握2门外语整体收益呢大于1门外语。所以第三语言的学习，它不但这个受益于得益于2语的知识，就是我学过英语了，我再去学德语，英语的知识很多可以转移到这个德语这个上面去。最重要的是2语学习的经验，他知道怎么去学了。这个当然我们这里不包括学的差的同学，他学的差的同学，他没有经验可言的话，他肯定不是越学越好。就是学得好的同学，他善于总结经验的那么他在学第二外语的时候，增加了文化的输入、知识的摄入，因为他肯定这个教材里面或者他阅读的文本里面关于德国的文化、历史各方面的知识肯定增加了，还有其他方面的百科知识。那么认知操作，就他学2门外语，这个2门外语就像普通人讲，他要打架的，你怎么个能够发挥你的原认知能力，就是能够控制，就是说你暂不需要的这个语言的知识，对吧？你调用检索调用这个你需要的语言知识，那么这个对我们的认知操作是一个挑战，也是一个锻炼。原认知策略，我刚才提到了，他是在其他课时不变的情况下要去学一门外语，他对他的时间安排的要求、学习策略的要求是非常高的，所以他的这种时间安排的能力，他的这个协调能力，就很多学生 他可能一门课程上面花的时间比较长，那么这样的话呢，其实他的效率不一定高，但是这些学生他就知道啊，这个英语看看，德语看看，然后数学做一做，语文做一做，他就会找到一个平衡的策略，他就会增加他的这个效益啊。那么元语言能力，就他对母语的认识，对第一外语认识的能力，它是不一样的。我等会举一些例子给大家看。他的社会情感能力，就他的包容性，他的同情心，他跨文化的一种意识，他跟其他同学也不一样。所以在这些方面，这些方面就是第二外语学习的这个收益啊，也是这个成功的要素。它迁移了，互相之间迁移，它拓展了我们的就呃这个简单的说，就它的知识拓展了，概念系统拓展了。实际上，呃，这个之前呢，也有这个心理学家，包括这个生理学家，这个他们做过解剖，多语学习者就能讲多种外语的人，他们解剖的时候发现大脑的灰质要比其他人要多。简单的说，就这些人大脑都跟人家不一样，大脑结构都不一样。这个我们做过一些调研，当时这个班上的学生啊，他们一共是45个，当时有43位同学参加了这个调研。就是我们有问过一个问题：你学习2门外语最大的收获是什么？大家看啊，获得知识，开阔视野，这个是最高的。开阔视野了，他就这个跟人的他给他的整个的感觉不一样，提升学习能力，转变思维方式，更加自信，结识国际友人。大概对应我们刚才讲到的几个方面的收益啊，这个它是一种直觉啊，还不是这个深入思考。实际上，可能他经过深入思考、反思以后，这个比例可能会更高。那我这里举2个同学的例子，有一位2018届的这个姓袁的同学，他是英语加日语。注意啊，这个很值得研究，就是说原来的很多的多语的研究呢，它英语加的后面那个第二外语的话，都是跟英语相近的，日语跟英语是没有关系的。当然，词汇里面可能有些介词，所以它这个转移的话，它实际上从英语里面直接转移迁移这个语言知识啊、语言技能啊，它不多，但是它英语学习的经验运用上去了，所以他们啊也取得了这个很大的成功。你看这位同学就日语演讲大赛1等奖，全国英语能力大赛高中组特等奖，就是说英语、日语都是达到了这个我说的那个一点的话，超过老师的水平。我们曾经举办一个活动啊，我们请了很多外语界的一些知名学者去，我们的学生啊，这种反应能力，就口语的流利程度、用词的这个复杂程度啊，句子的复杂程度，我们教授的叹为观止，就说我们英语教授不见得有他们反应快啊，确实水平很高。那么还有一位这个张同学也是英语加日语啊，他也是这个全国高中生日语演讲大赛啊，在日本举办的。这个大家我一开始也以为报道啊有问题了，就是说他们因为也等于一种奖励一样的啊，这个你可以参加总决赛了，就到日本去举办了。他拿了第1名，拿了总冠军。他在另外一次英语演讲大赛当中呢，也拿了冠军，双料冠军啊。所以说这个不是偶然的，这个成功啊有它的必然性。这位同学，还有有一些这个感悟啊，我当时请他们去写了，就是自己双外语学习的一些体会，他的过程，他的一些感悟。大家看，我这因为时间关系，我刚才看了一下，有10分钟，那我抓紧时间。大家看到这个，就刚才 我这里也做了一些标注啊，就是证明了我们刚才的这个一个呃总结呢是这个得到印证的啊，这是他自己的一些感悟。那么还有一位同学，更值得我们去关注。这位同学啊，他现在在 MIT，他化学获得个国际这个叫奥林匹不是奥林匹克啊，是叫英特尔国际能源化学奖，人称小诺贝尔奖。他被邀请去参加正式的诺贝尔颁奖典礼的。他的化学非常厉害，所以后来是被 MIT 录取的。那么这位同学呢，除了英语，还学西班牙语，而且到了后来，他自己呢就自主的去学拉丁语、意大利语、西班牙语，这个西班牙他是第二外语啊，这个德语、法语，而且他觉得就学起来非常轻松了。大家看啊，他的体会，他说双语学习让我开阔了眼界，让我形成了严谨的思维，拥有了很好的收集信息、总结信息、掌握规律的能力。他就是这个越会学各种实验研究证明的那个，这个有些呢跟我前面已经讲到了，我就不重复了。简单的过一下，多语学习者受母语和其他非母语的影响，这是毫无疑问的，而且受非母语的影响更大。如果说第一外语受母语的影响大的话，那么第二外语的话，它主要是受非母语的影响，这个很有意思。语言的差异影响多语学习者的跨语言迁移。刚才我讲到的，就学了英语以后学日语跟学德语，它情况是不一样的。所以学了英语、学日语这些学生啊，可能他花的力气更大一些，他的收益也更大一些。第三，语言熟练程度影响多语学习者语言迁移的类型和数量，影响其词汇的这个一个搜索啊，这个 retrieval 啊，就是语言的熟练程度。所以我刚才呃特别讲到，就是说我们要研究的就是它是一定是这个一种 formal education 啊，不是这个就是说仅仅是 pick up 这个 bits and pieces 啊，这个是那个不能够产生这个明显的影响。四，最近使用的语言影响多语者的跨语言迁移。就是说，一个人如果他同时掌握几种语言几种语言，那么能够对你现在说话产生影响的，就是你刚刚说过的语言，或者说一直在说的语言。第五，在非本族语环境居住或者接触的时长，影响跨语言迁移。如果你去到这个本族语 这个环境下，那情况不一样。那么你如果在非本族语的环境下，它情况也不一样啊。写的顺序，你先英语后德语，还是先德语后英语？那这个它是影响这个语言之间的关系的。多语学习者同时可能受到多种语言的影响，这个是毫无疑问的啊。非母语的语言熟练程度影响词汇语义组织。啊，这个时间关系我就不解释了。语言加工的负荷减缓多语学习者的一些任务执行过程。呃，最后呢，先前的语言知识和学习经验对第三或者以上的语言学习具有积极的作用。那么我们那还有一些因素啊，一些这个 parameters，一些这个参数，这个时间关系我也不一一解释了，有很多这个相关的因素。那么前面呢已经有了一些研究的发现，那么另外呢还有一些就是说这些因素啊可能产生影响，还值得我们去进一步研究的。那么对我们语言和认知能力发展研究的启发呢，这个时间关系我也只能过一下。这个根据 relevance theory，就说你大脑里面所有的你在进行语言加工的时候，你所有的知识，无论是你已经有的或者新增加的，甚至是同时在这个处理的，它都会影响你的这个语言使用啊。所以你学了一门外语，不管学到什么程度，都会影响你的母语使用。那么外语和母语是同一概念系统，还是各自独立的系统呢？原来呢，这个可能有人认为是两个独立的系统。那么现在呢，证据发现啊，越来越这个觉得呢，它是应该是 interconnected 啊。那么关键是如何 integrated 啊，如何 connected 啊？这个比如说这是英语的词汇图或者概念图，那我们在学德语的时候，他学了以后，他储存的方式，它跟英语是一样吗？另外储存还就在它周围，这个都值得我们去研究的。那么还有呢，有一位德国学者啊在上个世纪50年提出了这个，就双语啊，因为你学的时间、掌握的程度不一样，它有好几种情况，有 coordinate、有 compound、有 subordinate 的情况。那么每一种情况都会导致你大脑里面的 representation 啊是不一样的，这个值得我们去研究啊。而且呢，语言输出跟理解对应的概念系统是有差别的。这里呢，我也有一些例子，那么时间关系我也不讲了。第四种呢，就是语言输出的方式，就是我们有一个想法要去表达的时候，我们先决定语言呢，还是先把意义准备好再去决定语言呢？用什么语言呢？就是我们就是如果掌握了2门或者3门语言，我们就决定用哪一种语言来表达，它出现在哪一个阶段呢？这个是非常值得我们去研究的。有 conceptualizer、formulator，还有 articulator，还有超语。我这里展示一下给大家。这个我们国内有好多这个年轻人啊，这个流行语 hold 得住啊，high 翻了，这个 low 掉了，心情很 down 啊，you feel 了，out 了，有点 over 了，潮人 style 了，小 case 了。我 call 你呀、去 shopping 吧，好酷哦呀！啊，还有各种秀啊，双语，这个是超语。哎，为什么会出现这种情况？大家再看啊，还有这个白领们尤其在外企工作的这些人啊，我今天买了一件超有 feel 的 shirt，又去 Starbucks 喝了杯cappuccino 啊明天要做个 pre，我有个 assignment 要 due，deadline 是今晚啊，就这种情况大家也遇到过吧？那么这个叫超语。那么如果学了第二外语，你们会看到，因为现在这种情况比较少，是掌握这个2门外语或者3门外语的很少。但是大家去看看这个钱钟书的这个这个管锥编，他在讲一件事情的时候，他会引用好多这个不同语言的里面的这些那些经典的作家的一些话语，这个就相当于一种超语，对吧？那么就想想他为什么这样用，他为什么能够这样用，这个是值得我们去研究的。时间关系呢， 我就讲到这儿。好，谢谢。
好，谢谢，谢谢舒老师。我简短的稍微说两句啊。在构建外语教育教学的新生态一文当中，舒老师曾经指出，作为上海市英语教育教学基地的负责人，我们希望能够做到顶天立地，把国家的需要、政府的政策、外语教学理论的最新成果与基础外语教学的实际情况结合起来，与一线教师和学生的需求结合起来。今天，舒老师从认知语言学视角关注和研究多语学习，不单能够更好地理解语言和认知关系，更能有效地促进多语种人才培养，既有理论深度，又有实践价值，是顶天立地的又一个优秀的范例。舒老师也曾经在论文当中指出，也提到了据最新数据统计，我国缴纳的联合国会费呢已经占到12.01%，但是呢，我们的中国雇员的数量呢还不到2.5%，所以呢，培养具有国际视野、有良好的国际外语能力、沟通能力，是我摆在我们教育人的面前的非常重要的一项任务。那今天舒老师的报告，我觉得是，体现了我们外语人的责任感和使命感。今天的研究不仅为一线外语教学活动提供了积极的理论指导，更为我们如何开展深入的多语学习提供了崭新的视角和思路。相信呢，今后呢，对多语学习的理论和实践研究一定是大有可为。相信大家和我一样，都受到了非常大的启发，都受益匪浅。好，再次感谢舒老师。
谢谢李老
好，
师。
接下来谢谢舒老师。接下来我把话语交给南京师范大学的张辉教授，有请张辉教授介绍下一位主旨发言专家。有请张老师。
Okay. In this conference, we are honored to invite Professor Nick Ellis to have a talk. I will briefly introduce Professor Nick Ellis. Nick Ellis is a professor of psychology and linguistics at the University of Michigan. His research interests include the first language acquisition, second language acquisition, cognition, emergentism, corpus linguistics, cognitive linguistics, and applied linguistics, reading and speak and spelling acquisition, and psycholinguistics. He published several books, usage-based approach to language acquisition and processing, cognitive and corpus investigation of construction grammar, and agenda for language learning research, a handbook of cognitive linguistics and second language acquisition, implicit, explicit learning of language. He also serves as the editor-in-chief of language learning from 1998 to 2020. As we know that Nick Ellis, Professor Nick Ellis, his study focused on cognitive linguistics and language acquisition. I remember that he delivered a keynote speech at the 14th conference, 14th International Conference of Cognitive Linguistics. And his research is very influential and pushed the research of cognitive linguistics and second language acquisition to a higher levels. Now we invite Professor Nick Ellis to deliver a talk.
Hello, I'm Nick Ellis, and today I'm going to be talking about essentials of a theory of language cognition. By which I mean, if your theory of language cognition doesn't have these elements, then it's not a complete theory of language acquisition. I'll try and identify 4 or 5 aspects which I see to be essential and consider what each of them is and what each of them does in terms of informing language cognition, both our theories, but also language learners, what they get out of it. And towards the end, I will also consider what these elements give to theories of language instruction. So, essentials of a theory of language cognition. If you want to get any references or further ideas, you can look on my website, where a lot of the papers I cite are available. Essentials of a theory of language cognition. There's a little mnemonic here which allows us to identify 4 or 5 of the major elements. When I started interests in reading and other aspects of language in the 1970s, cognitive psychology was trying to do this. It was trying to identify the departments of the mind and how they communicate, the major modules, although, as we'll see as we get through this talk, along with many others, I believe that modules are made, not born. So in the 1970s, this was the beginning model. That there are different forms of memory and information is recoded from one system to the next. We'll see in a moment how those ideas developed. As I got more and more into second language acquisition in the 80s and 1990s, linguistics was questing after the essential elements, mental elements of language, and it had modules, it had theories pretty much like this. This is from Viv Cook's summary of the metaphor of universal grammar from the book Implicit and Explicit Memory for Language. And pretty much there is linguistic input, but the key aspect for our understanding of first and second language acquisition is access to universal grammar. So those are the 2 strands which are informing many of us today as we think about second language acquisition and usage-based approaches to second language acquisition. So cognitive psychology was looking for these components of departments of the mind. UG was looking for essential aspects of the language acquisition device as it affects our language cognition. And perversely, at that time, these 2 were autistic to each other. Linguistics thought that the essential components of the language acquisition device are divorced from general principles of cognition, and that we were to think about principles and parameters and access to universal grammar either directly to the second language that we were exposed to or via the first language. And so the debate was whether or not there was full access to UG, partial access to UG, no access to UG. This was pretty much the starting point. Now, cognitive psychology has come a long way since the 1970s. We started with a computational analogy for language cognition, which is that there is some input, we perceive something out there in the world, our cognitive system processes this, it looks up things in memory, it combines things in working memory, we think, we imagine, we initiate actions. So pretty much this is the classic sandwich view of cognition, which is there is perception, there is some cognition that works on what is perceived, and that is used to initiate actions. As time went on, we recognized some interactions between perception and memory, which is that cognition initiates actions, the actions change the state of the world, and so there is a cycle of interaction. And you can think of the sorts of cycles that were being talked about then, the cycle of interaction, or nicer's the cycle of perception, which is that we see a stimulus out there in the world, we think it might be something like that. That top-down processing guides our hypothesis search, and we look out there at that perceptual event again, trying to confirm or disconfirm that initial hypothesis. Things got more, thousands and thousands of cognitive psychological experiments led to models like this. This was very much the modal model of reading in the 1980s, informed by cognitive psychological experiments, psycholinguistic experiments, the neuropsychology of reading, where these departments of the mind, letter identification, looking at the visual input, the orthographic visual analysis, access to semantics, access to phonology, different routes to phonology, either direct lookup or grapheme phoneme conversion. This was very much the modal view, confirmed by many, many experiments. Crossing between experiments and neuropsychology. And over time, there was the rise of connectionism. This sort of model led us to believe that there are associated mappings between vision and phonology. Those mappings are from graphemes to phonemes. The mappings are probabilistic. And so we need to understand those probabilities of mapping. And that led to the rise of connectionism, parallel distributed processing models of statistical inference as we recode from one representation to another. And nowadays, with the advent of brain imaging, we can do our clever experiments, look at what areas of the brain are involved, and see the interconnections of those areas of the brain. And I guess we are somewhere here now, informed by all of these different theories of cognition. But it's still very much the case that what we're investigating is cognition in the head. And as I rather glibly reviewed in 2008, this is good old-fashioned psycholinguistics, sort of stealing from Maggie Bowden and good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, good old-fashioned psycholinguistics, focusing on the language learner as an associative network, a mechanistic processor of information, relatively unembodied, unconscious. All of these things are pretty much unconscious in their activation. Monologic. These are language users sitting in a psycholinguistics lab on their own with headphones on, unsituated, not in everyday, the wild of language use, asocial, uncultured. These models don't say very much about schooling or bilingual social contexts or anything else, and pretty much untutored. So that's 20th century psychology. We've learned an awful lot from it, but it was very much language cognition in the head. What's happened since then, perhaps in the last 20 or 30 years, beginning with Eleanor Roche, perhaps, but it's the recognition that cognition isn't in the head. Cognition extends well beyond the skull and the skin. And these are the ideas which feed into our recognizing these essentials of a theory of language cognition. The notion that we are embodied and that this brain talks to the world via these perceptual transducers. That we act out our cognition in the world, that it has consequences in our behaviors, and those behaviors in turn affect our cognition. That our cognition is embedded, we are embedded in society, a society now, the significant others and the significant institutions which affect where we live and how we get along, but also the origins of that society in time, so our culture. And that we have an extended mind that when we are cognizing, as I am doing now, I'm thinking about this PowerPoint presentation, this writing system that I use to make notes, this Zoom call, you out there in the world who I'm trying to communicate with. And I've learned a little bit about you, a very little bit, sadly too little, from my interactions with people from your culture, my friends in China, but also from reading about people in the world. So this is embodiment, enactivism, embeddedness, the extended mind, sometimes known as 4E cognition, sometimes known as post-Cartesian cognitive science. The notion that cognition is not just in the head, it is unbounded. This is distributed cognition in the world. We need to think about not one person's cognition in their head, but a cognitive ecology. Along the way, I'm going to add another E, which has been part of my thinking for 30 years or so, 40 years or so, emergentism, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. So, embodied cognition. We have these associative networks, which do mappings from different modalities, but these networks are, the input and output to them is through the body. I love this quote from Merleau-Ponty. The body is our general medium for having a world, a medium like writing or the movies. The body is our medium for having a world. We have these networks, but these networks are part of us acting out physically in a real world with its gravity and its laws of physics and its routine ways of dealing with the world. And if I want to understand a verb like push, then I need to know something about action dynamics and physics and the routine artifacts we have made, which we push in the world, or allow us to push better in the world. These notions of embodiment, Eleanor Roche, starting embodied cognition, but within linguistics, cognitive linguistics particularly, George Lakoff, Women, Fire and Dangerous Things. If we're thinking about those mental representations, those symbolic representations, well, as we've learned from AI, they are not enough. They need to be grounded in the world. And Lakoff was powerful in his making us realize that symbols are grounded in things that are meaningful to begin with. Two sorts of groundings: basic level concepts and kinesthetic image schemas. Basic level concepts, the concepts that cut across vision and motor action. Basic level context like a hammer. Hammers all pretty much look like that, and we do pretty much that with all hammers. Fruit, apples. Apples are basic level concepts. They all look pretty much like that, and we do that with them. So our grounding, our apple, is understood by visual representations of apples, motoric representations of apples, and our other perceptual systems, so taste as well. So what Lakoff did for the things out there in the world, which was the beginnings of cognitive linguistics, Langeker did for acting in the world, things that happen in the world, verbing in the world. Langeker developed cognitive grammar, the notion that all linguistic structures are meaningful. All linguistic structures are meaningful, and the meanings of these structures can be described in cognitive terms. What's crucially important is the space that we live in, and relations within that space. What's crucially important are things that happen in that space. They matter to us. Events happening in space and having consequences in time. And what language is for is to allow us to communicate those really important relations in as unambiguous a way as possible, preferably without being in the here and now of our interlocutors. So, embodied cognition has crucial effects on language and how it works. And you hear in a conference on cognitive linguistics, usage-based linguistics, and second language acquisition, you know about all of these foundational books and ideas in embodied cognition. So that's our first E. Our second E is enactivism. The notion that, yes, our cognition takes place, but it takes place not just here, it takes place in a world, and that world plays out in routine ways. So the way that football reacts to the motoric actions of our footballer here is predictable to that very skilled footballer who has gone through those routines many times before. We can think about a ball reacting in space and the routine physics of those interactions. We can think about people as they interact with us, and they too have expected reactions to what we do in a particular physical world. And we can think about the societal ways in which we have gotten used to interacting with people in culturally evolved multi-person routines. All of these are entrenched in our minds and in our expectations of the world, so that they can inform us in places that we've never been before. So that drop me in a forest that I've never been to before, but I can get ideas about where to go by looking at the way in which people who've been there before have negotiated their ways through that space by looking at the paths that have been entrenched by those who have gone before. As my friend Rob Stepney said, a path is the wisdom of many feet. So, embodied cognition, enactivism, embeddedness. We have these associative networks, but those associative networks talk to other associative networks that are embodied in other significant conspecifics, in the people who are important to us and who interact with us every day of our life. We don't learn our language by reading books or listening to the radio. As infants, at least, we learn our language richly tutored in a cooperative culture where our parents are trying to identify important things in the world and how they work. We share intentions. We share consciousness. We cooperate. We try to communicate. Infants share attention with their caregivers. They follow their gaze. They share intentions with their caregivers. They have shared goals. They cooperate. And Tomasello has done much to champion in first language acquisition the crucial importance in shared understanding and shared intentions, these origins of cultural cooperation and collaborative communication. It's embedded in a social, caring structure. And we've talked about that from Tomasello and first language acquisition, but there are strong links in second language acquisition too, in this notion of minds in society. Jim Lantolf has done much, particularly to champion these sociocultural inspirations to second language acquisition. Finally, the extended mind, informed, championed very well by Stephen Hutchins, distributed cognition. Distributed cognition, he was studying cognition in a closed, multi-person social system. How do cockpits work? How do people in a cockpit successfully make a plane take off and land? He's interested in knowledge not only within one individual, but in these individuals' social and physical environment. a coordination between individuals, artifacts, and the environment. And for sure, we know about that. And right now, in year 2022, we know about that, where here we are talking across the world using these technological systems and innovations which allow us right now to talk across the world. My understanding is so enriched by access to cognition around the world. Think about how often you access the internet each day to read a book, or read a PDF, or read a colleague's papers, or look something up on Wikipedia, or talk to a friend. The cognition in my head is routinely enmeshed and extended by these systems. Again, championed by Andy Clark, perhaps his wonderful explorations in supersizing the mind, cognitive extension, and the major burden of coupling between cognizing agents is through language itself. This is what we're using right now to share our understandings. And John Schumann often talks about his colleague Logan, the notion that it is language that extends the brain into a mind capable of conceptualization, the idea that mind is brain and language. So the extended mind, society is our extended mind and body. We are embedded in a society which, sure, we have these regularly recurring interactions in regularly recurring contexts of use. And yes, we have these neurobiological capacities and these mental modules which we've tuned by experience, but that experience has come from routine interactions with our families, our significant others, in our places of usual interaction, our places of work, our places of worship, our social organizations. We are part of a larger society, enmeshed in something which eventually has some government, where we've accepted some rules of behavior, or some routines of interaction, some socio-cultural institutions and communities, which has particular ideological structures, which are not just here and now, but which have been passed down as belief systems through the ages. And many of those ideas and actions have become concretized in various artifacts, computers, and technologies that allow us to share pictures, verbal and non-verbal interactional. Gosh, you can share my face and you can share my eyebrows, and that will affect how you interpret this particular message. So these are the ideas that we championed in the Douglas Fir Group paper in whenever that was, 2016, 17, a transdisciplinary framework for second language acquisition in a multilingual world. So those are our 4 E's: embodied cognition, enactivism, embeddedness, the extended mind. These are things which I view to be essential to a theory of language cognition. And I'm pleased to say that I've been thinking about them, certainly not completely, but I've been thinking about these things for some time now. The notion that, as in cognitive linguistics, we learn constructions, morphological, syntactic, lexical forms, which cue particular semantic, pragmatic discourse functions. These constructions are represented in connectionist networks, cross-modal connectionist networks. We learn those networks from usage. Usage has particular shapes. The power laws, scale-free distributions of usage tune those networks in particular ways. We don't have statistically flat cognition. There are hotspots of cognition which are particularly telling for how language works. Our usage is embodied. It's crucial how we attend to the world. Language is important for allowing us to do that, but our conspecifics are important in telling us which bits of the world to attend to. These interactions drive our attention and our consciousness. We are socially interacting, and at times we are doing our learning in instructional and cultural contexts. That was a slide that I made in 2007 in a second language acquisition symposium organized by Sue Gass and Alison Mackey, they coming from an interactionist informed second language acquisition. There have been many such elements of the social turn in second language acquisition theory. Jim Lantolf, Bonnie Norton, Elaine Tyrone, sociolinguistic approaches, Claire Cranch, cultural approaches, conversational analysis, Gabby Casper, Joss Wagner, language socialization, interactionist approaches, sociocultural, sociocognitive approaches, Dwight Atkinson, the sort of things which were gathered in the Douglas Fir group, all agree that cognition is socially grounded in interaction. As Wagner said, cognition is not understood as information processing, but as organized, embodied interactions between social actors in meaningful ecologies and reflexively being shaped by those situated encounters. Although the degree to which these approaches buy into issues of embodiment and ecology, they share a common understanding of learning as happening in context, through praxis, in everyday activities of communities of language users. The target for many second language learners is not just to speak another language, but to become part of the social and cultural environment in which the language is used. This entails frequent and rich participation in the second language life worlds into which the language learner bricolages his or her way. So the learner is not learning a language from a book or a grammar. The learner should be learning a language in the wild. Hutchins, Cognition in the Wild. The learner should be learning the language in the wild, where there are these cues and these affordances and these enmeshings in a routine social structure. And some researchers, like Steve Thorne, have picked up on that term rewilding, which is now being talked about in ecology and species preservation, and started to apply it to language learning too, where he's trying to adapt these he and other individuals trying to make use of communicative technologies nowadays, trying to rewild language activation, trying to put us back into those social situations. Now, all of these views of language cognition, all of these E's of language cognition have informed each of our language competencies. That's not to say that they have to be there all of the time. Having gone through all of those experiences, you can take the language learner and you can abduct him from or her from their normal routines, and you can stick them in a psycholinguistic cubicle, and you can ask them questions with their headphones on, and you can put them in front of keyboards and measure their reaction times, and you can ask them about things. And you can tap into that isolated mind. And when you ask it some questions, it can tell you things. Just like Proust could tell you what entered his mind as he tasted that Madeleine. And you can read Proust's remembrances of those times past and those wonderfully embodied, perceptually grounded memories of parts of his life long gone. But he can recreate them from his mind, and he can talk about them with his linguistic system very successfully, because yes, he does have language in his mind, but it's come from all of those interactions. Language is now in his head, now in his body. Language is now in him. These are the ideas, I think, the essential ideas in usage-based approaches to second language acquisition. I'm running out of time, but I will use these last 3 minutes to fly through some slides, which, well, you've seen them before from me, but you can read them in the PowerPoint. Language abilities, competencies coming from the sediments of usage events that are left as acquired linguistic constructions in the individual language learner. We have many writings on these usage-based approaches. Here are some of mine and colleagues in usage-based approaches to second language acquisition. Here are some of the many things which are components themselves of the usage-based approaches. Usage-based approaches to second language acquisition remind us that all of those E's are important. Looking at language through any single lens does not do the phenomena justice. Yes, we should acknowledge the social turn, but it doesn't deny any of these other elements that I've been talking about. It doesn't limit any theoretical approach to one of those cognitive or psycholinguistic viewpoints. It shouldn't limit any educational approach to any one particular aspect of those social interactions. Instead, it calls for greater transdisciplinarity, diversity, and collaboration in our investigations of language. I am particularly impressed and have been impressed by ideas of emergentism. I was first influenced by Brian McWhinney. That strand very much continues. Emergentists believe that simple learning mechanisms operating in and across the human systems for perception, motor action, and cognition, as they're exposed to language data as part of a communicatively rich human social environment by an organism eager to exploit the functionality of language, suffices to drive the emergence of complex language representations. Language and usage are like the shoreline and the sea. There are many books which take some of these ideas and try to inform practice, educational practice. The top and bottom rows here are very much from usage-based or cognitive linguistic influences. Those in the middle here would not necessarily call themselves usage-based or cognitive linguistic, but they're very much taking similar ideas and trying to inform education by developing task-based social interaction situations from which we can optimally learn language. And I think all of these and many others are fine collections on thinking about how to take these ideas and put them into language instruction. Over my career, I have much been informed by Mike Long, and here's a small tribute to Mike Long, who sadly left us last year. Some of these ideas, the language emergence or language as a complex adaptive system, have played out in my thinking from the beginnings of emergentism and language in language, but particularly from this collaboration, this meeting at the University of Michigan, which was then with all of these fine people. I thank them for their collaboration and their influence, and these ideas summarized at times in the notion of language as a complex adaptive system. I think this moral is a good one. I will leave it for you to look at in your own time. I've printed it once or twice at the end of particular papers. Some of the ideas I've been talking about today are available as full papers, and you can get them from my website. I particularly recommend the written version of this paper, which was published 2 or 3 years ago in the Modern Language Journal, Essentials of a Theory of Language Cognition. I revisited it very briefly this year in a bilingual language acquisition context, looking at new research, looking in great detail and great empirical sophistication from Titone and Tiv on language cognition in multilingual societies. I have played these ideas through as far as I can, most recently for the acquisition of second language morphology, and I've tried to give a broad perspective on the acquisition of second language morphology in this rather long paper, but I'm excited about it because it's one of the most recent papers that I've written. That's on second language morphology acquisition. My wonderful colleagues Uta Roma and Matt O'Donnell and I did a monograph on cognitive and corpus investigations of the acquisition of construction grammar 5 or 6 years ago now. The Douglas Fir group I've referred to, you can get that paper automatically from the Modern Language Journal site or download it from here. Many of these ideas we first summarized, Peter Robinson and I first summarized in 2008 in the Handbook of Cognitive Linguistics and Second Language Acquisition. They are briefly summarized in a chapter which has got some traction, jointly authored with my wonderful colleague Steffi Wolf, in a collection from Van Patten, Keating, and Wolf, theories in second language acquisition. You can get papers and the odd talk that I've given from my home site. That's it. I'm a few minutes over. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.
好，非常感谢这个，我们 Nick Ellis Professor Nick Ellis 给我们做了一个非常精彩的讲座啊。可能有的老师和同学呢，你如果对这个背景不是太了解的话，你可能听得有点云里雾里的啊。我简单的 简单的总结一下啊。然后 Nick Ellis 首先呢，他在他的讲座当中呢，他首先讲了这个就是这个他的一个关于这个就是他的一个关于语言的一个基本的一个理念啊。然后呢，他首先讲了这个这个理念呢，就是说这个语言呢，并不是在头脑当中啊，the mind our mind is not in the head 啊，我语言和思维并不在头脑当中。现在的观点呢，就是语言呢和思维呢，它是存在在我们的身体当中，它当然也存在在我们头脑当中，也同时也存在在我们身体当中。而且呢，它还存在着我们的这个生活的这个环境当中，是吧？所以他提出了这个哲学的这个基础呢，就是他的设身哲学和这个所谓的这个 4E 啊，这个 E 呢，A B C D E 这个 4E 呢，就是这个第一个 E 就是 embodied， 然后就设身的；第二个 E 是 embedded， 这在他讲座中讲了；第三个 E 呢就是 inactive 就是生成的啊。第四个 E 呢，就是 extended， 在他的讲座当中呢，他分别对这几个就是 4E 这个4E 这个呢，这个理念呢进行了这个总结和概括。他认为呢，就是人的这种认知发展的这种取决于我们人所处的这个物理环境啊，我们的物理的身体、物理的环境以及社会的环境。那在这个基础上呢，他又进一步论述了这个所谓的 usage-based approach to second language acquisition， 那这是认知语言学的一个基本的一个观点。而 usage-based approach to second language acquisition 其实也是建立在这种 4E 就是4E 的这种关于这个人类心智和语言的这种基本的哲学的这种观点上的，对吧？关于这方面的研究呢，他还提出了这个，比如 Andy Clark 他写的那本书 Supersizing the Human Mind， 另外还有这个Rowlands 写的 The New Science of Mind，New Science of Mind 等等等等，都对这个 4E 这个哲学观点呢，都进行了很好的论述。如果大家有兴趣呢，也可以去看一看关于现在最新的关于心智科学的一些新的一些观点。那然后呢，他又介绍了他自己的一些研究。比如说像这个 usage-based to construction grammar 等等等等，还发表了一些关于这方面的一些专著和论文。另外呢，他还提出这个 language as adaptive complex system 等等等这些观点，其实都和这个他提出来那个4E 的这个观点呢，这个就都是相吻合的。整个呢，他就是 Nick Ellis 呢，他的这个整个的这个他的这个哲学观点，关于心智的哲学观点，以及和他后边的这些关于 usage-based approach to language acquisition 等等等这些研究呢，都是基于一个最基本的一个理念，就是他刚才讲的那个4E 这个基本的这个观点这个他这个讲过程呢非常精彩，高度的概括在短短的20分钟内呢做了一个非常简洁但是又非常明细的一个讲座我们非常感谢Nick Ellis 给我们做出如此精彩的讲座。好，现在我把这个主持的这个工作呢交给下面一位老师。
Thank you, Professor Zhang Hui, for hosting the